This lecture is Women in Globalism, looking at the 1980s through current events. We see the culmination of second wave feminism happen in 1977 in Houston, Texas, at the International Year of the Woman Conference, where we see supporters of the ERA bill and anti-ERA bill, so advocates there. Which kind of gives us a clue as to how the feminist movement will go from then on into the 1980s, right? It was very mixed. There were some gains, though. In 1970s, 17% of Congress were women. In 1987, Women's History Month is established in the month of March. But we also see what historians call as the triumph of conservatism. Are the 1980s the triumph of conservatism? And some of the reasoning for this terminology is that we see a backlash in the 1980s with the emergence of the new right, who were anti-communist, much more economically conservative, meaning they believed in the free market policy, and that the government should be the enforcer of a traditional moral order in terms of race and gender. The new right tended to be mostly anti-feminist, anti-gay, and anti-abortion. We also see this as being the reign of Ronald Reagan for presidency. Reaganomics, which was his economic policy, did not reach women, the poor, or racially diverse. Right, his trickle-down economics really helped to aggravate a growth of social and economic inequality in the 1980s. This is also a time when historians see this as a post-industrial economy, where most of the economic base is shifting from being more industrial, product-driven to more service industry, computer-driven, which is kind of the beginning of globalization. The death of feminism in the 1980s. Some reasons we could see the death of feminism in this time period is the ERA bill, the Equal Rights Amendment, is defeated in 1982, largely with the help of the Phyllis Schlafly Stop ERA campaign. And a lot of national women's rights organizations just tapered and tended to retreat. And so this is seen as sort of a post-feminism era where there is kind of a social majority believing that feminism had been achieved and there was no longer a need for a quote-unquote feminist or women's movement. And it tended to be an unpopular cause with younger generations, right? This is sort of maybe parallel to what we see in the 1920s with the women who, saw themselves as the flapper, right? They were reaping the rewards of the previous generation's women's movement, but they were not necessarily going to carry the torch and carry on those causes. The role of the media, there's really not a single strong feminist voice, right? We have the exceptions like politician Sandra Day O'Connor in the Supreme Court, Sally Ride being the first women in space, women serving in the U.S. military in the Persian Gulf War, and obviously there are more women participating in politics. But the role of the media was sort of mixed. Fashion tended to be more quote-unquote feminine with the cinched waist, high heels, mini skirt, and big hair, as you can see from the Yuppie handbook here, where we sort of see a fashion that is more reminiscent of the Victorian era in the 1980s. But the magazines and the media were seem to consistently warn women of if they focus too much on their career and not finding a relationship, a husband, then they were going to end up single, they would have no biological children, and this tends to be some of the role that the media plays in this anti-feminist trend. That seems to change in the 1990s. There's a remobilization of feminism, and it really starts with states that are placing restrictions and laws against abortion, kind of going against the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision in the 1970s. And these states' restrictions against abortion kind of lends its hand to a new generation of feminists. This is also a time in the 1990s that historians call the lesbian baby boom, where advances in technology are allowing lesbian couples to have children via either a sperm donor or a surrogate. Women's studies becomes more institutionalized across universities and college campuses. And we see the 1990s popular media presenting a stronger sort of feminist women's voice as well. In 1990, the Mills College protest to keep the school for women only is an example of some of these movements and demonstrations. The role of Madonna as this sexual, out there, strong woman who's feminine yet also in control of her life starts to really develop a new notion of what a woman can be, right? In charge of her sexuality, yet also in charge of her voice. The Riot Girls movement that we see kind of beginning in the Pacific Northwest, representing underground punk scene and an inclusiveness of females in an otherwise male-dominated music industry. Sassy Magazine inspired the development of Ms. Magazine, all of which really focused on women's issues and empowering women. The Anita Hill effect. Third wave feminism really culminated with this one event in which we see Anita Hill kind of bring attention to the need for maybe a women's movement to be reinvigorated. Let me back up. What is third wave feminism? It was redefining what it meant to be a feminist. It was much more inclusive. It emphasized intersectionality, which many critics of second wave feminism, called out that it failed to be inclusive of queer women, of women of color, of immigrant women. And third wave feminism set to address those issues and become more inclusive and focus more on an intersectional approach to female issues and what that would include. So less middle class white women's issues. So the Anita Hill effect. Clarence Thomas was a Supreme Court justice bid for to become part of the Supreme Court, and Anita Hill charged that he had sexually harassed her, and that her allegations were largely overlooked. Congress heard her; she testified, and yet he was sworn in as a justice anyway. Very similar to what we saw in the more recent swearing in of Justice Kavanaugh a few years back. So this led to just an overall increased support for national female candidates, right? Emily's List became one of those ways that we see greater support, financial and sort of grassroots support for getting more females into Congress, into national politics, but also local and state politics as well. And this sort of energized kind of this third wave feminism. Hillary Clinton, in a lot of ways, was a revivalism of feminism for her work as, First Lady in the Clinton administration. Her thoughts on human rights and trying to, expand the women's movement to be, again, more focused on global women, not just women in the United States and the issues that were going on across the world, especially as the U.S. was becoming more economically globalized. So here we have an image of Anita Hill, and just the fact that she was not believed, right? That her testimony was sort of negligent in Clarence Thomas's swearing in. So it brings us to looking at women in the 2000s. We see some some issues that came from second wave feminism, like violence against women, being brought back to the national attention. The Violence Against Women Act, for instance, in 2013, is brought before Congress to really call on just the different types of domestic and sexual battery that particularly was happening on college campuses, that was brought to the national political attention in the 2013 Act. The advent of the Black Lives Matter movement after the killing of Trayvon Martin and his killer being acquitted and set free led to this resurgence of a civil rights movement in some ways. And within that movement, really focusing again on African American women who are also being brutalized and killed by police brutality. So Say Her Name campaign became a sort of hashtag and a social media response to the continued violence that different women of marginalized descent face. The election of 2008, we see bringing in the first African-American president, Barack Obama, and his administration had a tremendous impact on creating greater access to healthcare for poor, working class immigrant women and families, right, with the Affordable Care Act or the Obamacare. The First Lady, Michelle Obama, being a tremendously strong and empowering symbol for women across the nation and the world, coming in and really having to address some of the stereotypes that people had about strong Black females, and the work that she continued to do even after her presidency is tremendous. The election of 2016, right, this sort of really hard time for women, with Hillary Clinton losing the election and Donald Trump winning the election, and just the impact that had could be discussed at further length. But in some ways, a lot of women's rights issues and gains seem to have been put on hold because of that. The same day as Trump's inauguration, we see the Women's March on Washington in 2017.